You could drive straight through Birmingham once, right across the centre, without stopping at a single traffic light. The inner ring road was built to make that possible. A complete loop, finished in 1971, threading around the core of the city like it had been dropped on top of it rather than planned with it. People call it a mistake now, but back then it was sold as progress. Flyovers, underpasses, slip roads that seemed engineered for a city expecting far more cars than it ever actually got. The part that's hard to picture today is how uninterrupted it felt. You'd leave one junction, barely change lanes, and the next one arrived almost immediately. Everything around it was sealed off behind guardrails and concrete edges. Pedestrians were pushed underground, which made sense on paper, but half of those subways turned into places nobody really wanted to use. Still, the road functioned for what it was built for. Constant movement, no hesitation, no slowing down unless traffic forced it. Now most of it's gone or reshaped. Not removed overnight, just chipped away. St. Chad's Circus reworked. Mass House torn up entirely. The Suffolk Street Queensway stretch softened and stitched back into street level. Each change chipped at the idea of the collar, until only certain curves and junctions survived. You can still trace the rough shape if you know where to look, but you can't drive it the way it once worked. The strangest detail is that people who grew up with it barely realised how unusual it was until it disappeared. The freedom to cut through a major city centre without ever really entering it, that's the part you can't do anymore. Bullring vanished because the city finally decided it wasn't worth patching anymore. That's the outcome. Everything else is messy. Some reports blame the concrete, some blame the layout, and others claim the decline didn't start until the late 80s, even though photos from the mid-70s already show cracking slabs and blocked drains. It opened in '64 with ramps, split levels, and that underground car park people still argue about. Half say it was efficient, half say it was a maze. The whole design depended on separating cars and pedestrians, which sounded modern until it forced shoppers into dead ends the planners never fully admitted existed. The outdoor market adapted better than the centre itself. Stallholders just worked around whatever wasn't functioning. Then demolition arrived in the year 2000, as if refurbishing had never been an option. And some still claim it couldn't have been saved at all. Why was a sauce factory allowed to take over an entire chunk of Aston for more than a century? The original site opened in 1875, and the one detail everyone agrees on is the smell. That thick, vinegary steam that drifted across the railway lines and settled over half the neighbourhood on certain days, while almost everything else you read about the place drifts between precise figures and vague recollections. Production figures jump around depending on the source, though most mention that Aston was turning out tens of millions of bottles a year by the 1970s, and the layout barely changed until the final upgrades in the 90s. Someone once mentioned the bottling hall had a rhythm you could hear from the street, which sounds exaggerated, but it fits the descriptions of how constant the machinery was. The factory closed in 2007, one last shipment, then that was it. The exact shade on the rear panel, that slightly faded cream strip under the window, was the detail that defined an entire bus fleet that doesn't exist anymore. Those blue and cream West Midlands PTE double-deckers were everywhere in the early 70s, officially rolled out after the 1969 Transport Act reorganised local services. And the conclusion is simple, that livery disappeared because the entire network kept getting reorganised, repainted, merged and modernised until nothing of the old scheme survived. The dates line up if you follow them carefully. PTE branding from '69, large batches of Daimler fleet lines entering service in the early 70s, repainting starting again in the 80s under West Midlands travel, wiping out the two-tone look almost route by route. Some drivers said the cream panels showed grime too quickly. Others said the cost of maintaining multicolour paintwork was the issue. Short answers everywhere, longer explanations buried in old depot memos. And if one survived in full original colours, where would it even be now? Why does everyone talk about 1970s New Street like it was some cosy relic? It wasn't. It was low-ceilinged, brown and permanently tired, and the key facts hit you straight away. The 1966 rebuild created the boxy concourse, the linoleum floors, the fluorescent strips, and that sealed-over layout that sat under the bullring like a giant car park pretending to be a station. After that, the interesting bits branch out everywhere. You had the narrow escalators, the platforms you could barely see from the concourse, those oddly placed passageways, and signage that seemed to change style depending on which part of the building you'd wandered into. Some people swear the place always smelled slightly metallic. Others insist it was just the diesel drifting in through gaps that shouldn't have existed anyway. There was a rumour about a lost corridor behind platform 12 that went nowhere, which never made sense, especially since the station wasn't confusing at all. People always assume the old markets were charming in a quirky sort of way, and that's the bit they get wrong. They were sprawling because nobody was really steering the thing. Stalls stretched wherever they could fit, traders shifted positions depending on who showed up first, and the whole place drifted forward in a straight line through the 70s, without anyone deciding whether it was meant to be temporary or permanent. You'd walk past fish sellers shouting prices over crates that looked borrowed from 3 different wholesalers, then straight into fabric stands balanced on mismatched trestles, and somehow it all worked because the demand was constant. That's why the council kept patching it rather than replacing it. For a moment you'd think about how the smells overlapped in ways no modern market would allow. No, ignore that. The important part is how completely unorganized it was. The old metal shutters stayed even when half the stalls disappeared. Why did Pebble Mill feel bigger than it really was? That's usually where this starts, because the building itself opened in 1971. One main TV studio, radio suites tucked along the corridors, wasn't enormous, yet everyone who worked there talks as if it was a whole ecosystem. You had Pebble Mill at 1 happening in the foyer, Radio WM broadcasting a floor away, editors running tapes between rooms because the internal messaging system froze at least once a week, and crews drifting between sets so close together you could hear rehearsal notes leaking into the corridor. For all the myths, one thing is consistent. The place felt constantly in motion. Someone once mentioned you could walk from a children's TV prop cupboard to a current affairs set without turning a corner, which sounds impossible until you look at the old floor plans. It was demolished in 2005. It disappeared long before anyone figured out how a place that busy could vanish so completely, which is the odd part. Demolished in the 1980s, the whole thing flattened as if the decade of packed gigs, dance nights, and visiting chart acts hadn't happened at all. People say the Locarno was enormous, though the floor plans never quite agree on the exact capacity, only that the main hall could swallow up a crowd in seconds, and the balcony always felt slightly too high for comfort. One night you'd get a soul band, the next a rock act, and then a roller disco, because management thought theme nights were the future. Someone once claimed you could hear the bass from the street outside even when the doors were shut, which may or may not be true, but it fits the vibe. And then it was gone. Most people talk about them like they simply died out, but the truth is, the wet-only M and B pubs were already finished the moment redevelopment maps started replacing half the back streets they sat on. Boarded windows, sold off licenses, whole blocks cleared in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, while people acted like pubs were somehow immune to planning policy. Small corner houses with barely a food menu in sight, tiled fronts, etched glass, and regulars who treated every stool as assigned seating. Some had identical layouts because M&B repeated the floor plan across the city. Others were odd little conversions that never made sense on paper, but stayed open for decades anyway. You'd hear stories about the Albion, the Horseshoe, the Chainmakers, depending on which part of town you grew up in, each one slightly embellished. By the time gastropubs took over, half of them were rubble, and the rest were closing quietly. It's a strange fact, but you really could buy fish straight off the boats at Gas Street Basin in the early 70s, and it still feels like something someone invented as a joke. The traders were small-scale, half formal, half whoever happened to know the route from the black country canals into the city centre. They'd tie up near the towpath, lift open battered lids, and sell whatever had survived the journey in metal crates that looked older than the boats themselves. Some people swear the fish tasted better. Others say it always smelled like the canal. Both can be true. The human part is what sticks. Office workers leaning over the water on lunch breaks, a couple of regulars turning up at the same time every week, and the odd kid asking whether the boats slept there overnight. They didn't. They moved constantly, chasing small profits across a network no one really mapped. And it just stopped. They were already gone by the 70s. That's the part people forget. The tram stopped running in '53, yet their leftovers hung on like the city hadn't finished tidying up. Old tracks poked through resurfaced streets, a few overhead poles still stood beside bus stops, and the depots in places like Miller Street looked half abandoned, even while being used for something else. You'd hear someone insist the system vanished cleanly, but every photo album from the decade disagrees. Some stretches of rail sat flush with the curb, so worn down you'd only spot them when the light hit right. Some were raised slightly, catching bike tires. Some were buried under tarmac that cracked every winter. All of it felt temporary, even though it lasted years. You'd see kids asking why there were rails with no vehicles. You'd see older Brummies point out routes they used to ride. One pole stayed up well into the 70s. Rusted, leaning, never explained. You'd notice it first on your coat, a faint grey dust that settled even if you'd only walked from the bus stop to the shops. And that tiny detail says more about 70s Birmingham than any official report ever could. From there, the whole picture widens. Dozens of foundries, metal pressing plants, car factories, and battery works operating at once, each with its own plume drifting across the city, depending on which way the wind fancied going that day. The haze wasn't dramatic, it was just there. Factories didn't run filters the way they do now. Lorries idled for ages. Even the smaller workshops along the back streets had chimneys that worked all day, and nobody questioned how normal it seemed to wipe residue off window ledges every morning. The odd part is how planned it all was. Deliveries scheduled at specific hours, furnaces timed around shift changes, exhaust stacks positioned to disperse efficiently, even though everyone knew it never quite dispersed enough. There's a story from one area about residents hanging laundry indoors because the air dulled colours. Absolutely believable. And somewhere in Small Heath, one chimney kept its distinctive orange tint right up until the week the site shut down. People assume the Tyburn setup was just another roundabout. It wasn't. It was a multi-level knot of concrete that worked in ways no one can fully agree on. And even the records can't decide how many redesigns it went through before the big changes in the 80s and 90s. What's certain is that the 70s layout, the A38 meeting the A47 with slip roads curling under and over each other, felt more like a mechanical device than a piece of road planning. The whole system depended on sequencing. Lane merges time to seconds. Slip roads so tight you had to commit early or you'd miss the turn entirely. Some older diagrams show an additional spur road that never appeared in later plans, as if the city dropped the idea halfway through construction and just paved over whatever was there. Drivers from that era still talk about the elevated section vibrating slightly at rush hour. One of the last original pillars stood until 2004. Why do people talk about 70s Villa Park like it was some lawless frontier? The only part that consistently lines up across old match reports is the terrace layout, especially the Halter end, a single sloping wall of standing bodies that moved almost as one when a goal went in. Everything else gets fuzzy. Exact capacities vary depending on which program or safety paperwork you believe, and the numbers jump around enough that you start doubting any of them were measured the same way twice. So you focus on the one clear detail. It was standing. Pure standing. No seats, no rows, just crush barriers spaced at intervals, and stewards relying more on routine than regulation. From there, the picture widens. Turnstiles clicking too slowly, cigarette smoke drifting sideways, and the odd claim that you could feel the halter shift under your feet during big games. Though that might just be supporters exaggerating, and apparently it was perfectly safe. Except when it obviously wasn't. What people get wrong about 70s Birmingham car buying is imagining it worked like a normal dealership experience. It didn't. If you bought direct from Longbridge or Castle Bromwich back then, the whole thing felt halfway between a factory tour, a collection appointment, and a favour someone arranged behind a desk. Early brochures make it sound formal: order sheet, handover, handshake. But most of the stories that survive are about workers guiding relatives through side gates, or customers turning up in clothes that immediately picked up the smell of cutting oil. The detail that anchors everything is how personal it seemed. You'd see rows of Astons or Minis still wearing chalk marks from inspection, with the OK scribbles half rubbed off by somebody's sleeve. After that, the picture gets vague. Some say you could watch your car come off the line. Others insist that never happened. Both versions float around because collecting a car from its birthplace meant something different to everyone. And the last factory collection centre at Longbridge closed without ceremony.